You have been chosen to build a bridge across the River Kwai. If you work hard, you will be treated well. But if you do not work hard, you will be punished.
My name is Nicholson. I must call your attention to Article 27 of the Geneva Convention. No officers will do manual labor. They're going to put him in the oven.
About the escape committee, sir.
There won't be any escape committee. 1 chance in 100 of survival.
If I am to die, others will die before me.
Give in, sir. Please. No. It's a matter of principle.
I'm declaring a general amnesty. It will not be necessary for officers to do manual labor.
We'll show them what the British soldier is capable of doing.
Are you convinced that building this bridge is a good idea?
Can you finish the bridge in time?
Japanese aim to open the railway. Naturally, we're going to try and prevent it. I'm going to take a team in and blow it up. How would you feel about going back?
Come again.
There's something rather odd going on.
Wait for the train.
Is this your soldier's code?
If we give in now, there'll be no end to it.
Kwai began as a novel published in 1952 in France by Pierre Boulle. And this book was published in Britain a couple of years later and was picked up by Carl Foreman, who was an American, had written High Noon, and was then blacklisted as being a probable communist and was forced out of Hollywood and came to Britain to live as an exile, where he worked under a variety of pseudonyms. And it was then that Spiegel just happened to bump into Foreman and took the project over.
I was shooting a picture with David Lean in Venice called Summertime, starring Katharine Hepburn and Rosanna Brazzi. And while we were shooting, we received a book from Sam Spiegel called The Bridge on the River Kwai, which was an English translation of a French book. Now, David Lean couldn't read it because he was shooting every day and it was very difficult shooting. So I read it and I said, well, it's a marvelous and original idea. Later on, when the picture was finished, we contacted Sam Spiegel, who was in London, and he said, I have the most marvelous script. It's the best script that's ever come my way in the whole of my career in motion pictures. It's been written by Carl Foreman, who is a well-known writer. He's in New York at the moment, and he's just polishing the script. What I'd like to do is, first of all, David Lean to come to New York and meet with Carl Foreman, because I want him to read this script.
David was very broke when he split up with his former wife, Ann Todd, and he desperately needed to make some money. So by making pictures out of England, that was a tax advantage from his point of view.
So that was decided and contracts were exchanged and so on. And the deal was made with Spiegel's company called Horizon Pictures, GB. And that company had a deal with Columbia Pictures as the distributors of the picture and also as the financiers of the picture. Now, David Lean went to New York, and the next day he called me and he said, Norman, is it possible for you to come to New York because something has got to be done? And I said, why? What's the script like? He said, it is so awful. I said, have you told Sam? He said, yes. I said, what did he say? He said he went quite white. And he said, I've told him that if he wants me to do this picture, you've got to throw this script totally away and we've got to start from scratch all over again. You come out to New York, we'll sit down, and in 3 or 4 weeks, we'll produce an initial treatment from the book.
Where the film was going to be made, so he could sort of soak up the atmosphere. So Spiegel then brought out another writer called Calder Willingham, who Lean took an instant dislike to. Willingham wrote Paths of Glory, which is a famous anti-war movie directed by Stanley Kubrick, which is often compared to Kwai because they came out within months of each other. Anyway, Willingham did not get on with Lean at all, and I think he stayed about 2 weeks. And then Spiegel brought out this guy called Michael Wilson, who, like Foreman, was also blacklisted.
Michael Wilson worked really up to the deadline, almost up to the shooting date, to finalise the definitive script. And I think that was the script that was finally shot. I guess because of the un-American activities blacklisting, Carl Foreman nor Michael Wilson received any screen credit at the time. The screenplay was credited to Pierre Boulle, but Pierre Boulle had no input onto the screenplay whatsoever. In fact, the book originally was written in French anyway, and I think that, I don't know if he could have written an English script.
But in Sutton, by an English Marine officer called Colonel Alford. He was dead, but his widow was alive. We got permission from her to use it. And she was an old lady, and I think she benefited a great deal from the subsequent royalties, which were marvellous for her. The book concerns itself entirely with the story of Colonel Nicholson and his men and the prisoner of war camp. Columbia Pictures were a little worried because they were spending a lot of money on this picture. I mean, it was 1956, and I think the total budget was $2.8 million, which was a hell of a lot of money then. And they wanted an American star. And we all said, well, how can we put an American star? It's such a British picture in many ways. But David Lean thought up the idea of the Shears character, the American who's in the camp and escapes and then is sent back. When we were in New York doing this first treatment, Spiegel took us out to have dinner with Cary Grant because he thought that he could play Shears. And charming man that he was, and a lovely dinner we had, it wasn't for Cary Grant. In fact, Variety carried a story that Charles Laughton had been approached for the part. Well, he hadn't, and simply because in terms of common sense, you could not believe that fat Charles Laughton was in a prisoner of war camp living on starvation rations. It just wouldn't work and wouldn't look good. All sorts of names went past. Ralph Richardson, an English actor, Ronald Coleman, that David Lean rather liked the idea of, but wasn't that young at that time. And almost last came Alec Guinness. But Alec Guinness didn't really want to do the part. And Alec Guinness said, well, just explain to me what sort of character Nicholson is. And David seen, well, he's a sort of bore of that kind of upper-class Englishman. And Alec Guinness said, you mean you want me to play a bore?
Colonel, do you suppose we could have a cup of tea?
And Alec Guinness said, no, I don't want to do it. I'll pay my fare and go home. But somehow David persuaded him. Now, they had one or two quarrels during the course of the film, but I mean, the rest is history, because when Alec Guinness, who's a very generous and outgoing man, saw the finished picture, he was absolutely unstinting in his praise. A river and a lovely location for the bridge about 60 miles from Colombo in Ceylon. And he found this spot where they could actually build the bridge, where the riverbed was strong enough to take the weight of the piles. And I think it was a Danish firm that were employed to build the bridge.
At the time, I was a young civil engineer working in Ceylon. I'd spent 6 months in a jungle there in 1954. The film was quite interesting to me because before that I'd been dropped by parachute behind the lines in France and Germany and been hunted a bit, and incidents with knives and things like that, so that the background to the film was quite familiar to me. I worked with a firm of consulting engineers. They set up an office in Ceylon. And around 1955, we had a visit from Don Ashton. Sam wanted to be persuaded that a full-size bridge would work. And he wanted to meet the guy who was going to build it.
And looked at everything, and he was wonderful in the picture. So we did without the British War Office.
He was always on hand to provide any information on how troops would behave, how they would stand, how they would salute. And the extras that were recruited from amongst a most extraordinary array of civilians, Malaysians, Europeans, Eurasians, anybody that was half white was kind of press-ganged into acting as extras in the picture.
Our director of photography, Jack Hilliard, was a man we'd worked with on several pictures, and he was a very amiable, lovely man. And David Lean is nuts about photography, and he takes an immense interest. So his cameraman has to be somebody who's simpatico with that, and he and Jack Hilliard got along on all these pictures very, very well indeed.
We literally built a camera from scratch in Shepperton Studios, a blimp cinemascope camera. which had never been made before, because it was made of composite parts. I went to Ceylon and rented the generator, the power unit for the production, and it was difficult to photograph because in those days there was no lightweight widescreen equipment. It didn't exist. Logistically, it was difficult. All the lighting was powered by the generator which we bought, and then it had to be transported up and down the river and from side to side and from location to location.
One day, we were underneath the bridge, and when he leaves, Sessue throws himself on the bed, sobbing. David couldn't get him to do it right. He tried and tried, couldn't get it, wasn't satisfied. Finally said, all right, print it. About a week later, when the stuff came back, he said, now we're going to have to do all this all over again because of you. All this money and all this time because of you and your bad acting and things like that. You know, we really gave him a hard time. And finally, when the man threw himself on the bed, he was really crying. Crying. That poor old fellow was crying.
I think that if he was faced with an actor or actress who he didn't completely feel was right for the part, he would work that extra hard to draw a performance out of him. I can remember that happening on several occasions. He would often start off a picture and feel after the first week that so-and-so was a bit of a disaster, but in the end, they'd probably turn out stealing all the notices.
Men is coming over the bridge to visit the camp.
David decided to cover the explosion of the bridge with 5 cameras. One was the master camera which he was on, which was downstream, looking back up the river towards the bridge, which was the classical full-screen long shot. The other shots were pre-positioned, and they were built like dugouts with little holes for the cinemascope camera to peep through, and there were 4 of those. We did think at one time of maybe putting a camera actually on the train, but he said, well, that's not really from anybody's point of view. It might be a lovely shot, but I don't know how I could use it, so we discarded that. And we've just placed the other 4 cameras around the bridge to get the best possible angles, and they were all shot with the cameras slightly speeded up. Now, in order that the shot should go smoothly, the art director, Don Ashton, devised quite a clever system of lights. Once the cameras were running up to speed, each cameraman would switch a switch on in his camera position, and that in turn would light a light on a circular board with 5 lights around it and a lamp in the center. The cameramen, nobody knew how ferocious the explosion was going to be. When the engine driver jumped off the train just before the bridge, there was another switch which he was to switch on, so that would indicate at the main control center that all 5 cameras were rolling and the engine driver had safely jumped off the train and it was safe to blow it.
We decided that we would use a big international company called ICI, which I think stands for Imperial Chemical Industries, and they took over the actual blowing up of the bridge. David Lean wanted it to be blown up with one big charge so that the Japanese train would fall as the charge went off under it. But Spiegel insisted, and I think common sense said they had to put 2 or 3 charges. And when you see the bridge going up, there are 1 or 2, or perhaps even 3 explosions. Now, the first day we had all sorts of people. Spiegel brought people along. It became a great big thing to watch this blowing up of this great structure. The lights went on, 1 light didn't. But however, the train had started. So what happened was we cancelled the instruction to blow up the bridge. The train went across the bridge, gathering speed, something like 30 miles an hour, which is quite fast.
The whole train went thundering over the bridge, and the one thing that saved the whole train from destruction was the fact that it ploughed into the electrical generator which powered the lights and the camera at the other end of the bridge out of picture. And that's what saved the whole train from plunging back into the river again.
One of the cameramen had just literally forgotten to switch his light on. In his anxiety to get away, he just forgot to switch the switch.
And I said, well, you know, I'll get a crane up from Colombo and we'll lift the train back on the track. So I went back to base, to the camp, to telephone Colombo, and spoke to the Minister of Engineering. And he said, no, he said, you will never have any of my cranes. I said, why, what's wrong? He said, you didn't invite us to the blowing up of the bridge. So that was a bit of a blow, because now we really were stuck, because it was the only crane on the island. It was strong enough to lift the engine. But the train engineer was very bright, and he rushed down to Colombo, and he found some big jacks, and they jacked the train up on these jacks. And finally, at around 11 o'clock at night, without stopping, we got the train back on the tracks.
And then the whole process was repeated when everything had been reset up again and the train pulled back into position.
This time I drove the train. I set the throttle and put a little nut and bolt through a hole to make sure it stayed there, and then got off at the end of the bridge. And I had a better view than anybody, actually. Different view, anyway.
I remember rushing out, putting my light on, and then going into this hide. I guess about the middle of May.
David Lean loves the whole business of making a film. He's wedded to it. It's like a religion to him. He finds it very difficult to stop shooting because he's always got all sorts of ideas of little grace shots that can be done and so on. That was another bone of contention with Spiegel, who, as producer, quite rightly said, look, we've got to come to an end. We've got, everything is in the bag. And David would say, yes, but I need that shot of the bird. Well, why do you need that? Could we not do without it? No, that's an integral part. And so David Lean, I think, was left behind with a camera operator and a camera. And even then, when he was, in effect, hauled back, he was protesting that there was still another shot he wanted to do. David Lean was very broke at this time, and I think in cohorts with Spiegel, it was arranged that his contract would be signed in the Bahamas, but even so, David Lean couldn't come back to England for 1 year or even 2 years. And it was for that reason that, of course, the picture was cut in Paris, because Spiegel wanted very much, and it would have been madness not to have had David Lean present in the cutting. It was a concern all the time in the scripting stage and when the picture was cut that it would be very long. It's always a worry with long pictures because exhibitors say if the picture's too long, we can only get 1 or maybe 2 showings a day, and it's going to...
Close-up of the boot going up and down in time to the da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, and a flapping sole on it, you know. Brilliant little touches. That's when I first realised, when they marched in their camp, I thought, we're making a classic.